All right, congratulations. You won the house of your dreams. It's under contract. Appraisal comes in $15,000 below what your contract value is. Lender says they won't give you the difference. The seller's threatening that they're going to walk. How do we handle these situations? I'm going to go over that and more on why appraisals exist in the very first place. First and foremost, all right, again, congrats, $15,000. The important part to understand here is, let me be a stupid question. Why do lenders exist in the first place? They want to lend money and get paid back on that money. Otherwise, the model wouldn't really work, right? So lender wants you to pay, right? You, money, sad face, what gives? Lender wants you to pay that money. Question may be, is the house actually worth that value, right? So why would the appraisal exist in the first place? The point of the lender to order the appraisal is they don't want to write a bad loan. And for every dollar over maybe an arguable value, right? I'm gonna use that word specifically, arguable value, is because if they lend you $1 million on a property that arguably is only worth $500,000, it's only really a matter of time before you go, I made a terrible decision as a buyer, and I'm writing this big old fat check on $1 million that I really, now that I think about it, it's only worth about 500. I'm looking around what's going on, and the chances of you defaulting go up the higher and higher and higher that goes, especially with a low down payment. All right, so what is a property worth in general, right? What determines that price? Well, at the end of the day, it's whatever someone's willing and able to buy with, period. In a sense, this is every product or service that has ever existed, something is worth what someone is willing and able to pay for it, right? If they have cash, well, I don't need a loan. Right? I don't have to go to the bank and ask for permission. It doesn't have to be based on my DTI. It doesn't have to be based on my income level. It doesn't have to be based on my ability to keep my job or how long I've been working at a job. If I've got cash, let's just say I inherited that from grandma, I can go and do whatever I want with that house. And you can offer $1 million on a $500,000 home. But that doesn't tend to happen, okay? So how many of those tend to be cash purchase? If you look at like history, let's just say the last 100 years, the cash market, the people buying cash, varies and goes up and down for a bunch of different reasons, but it's kind of ranged between 10 to about 33%. There were some markets that were as high as 50% at a period of time during like COVID, but our market right now, it's about 20, 25%. Again, worth, willing and able, that's a really important key metric. If we come over, we go, all right, well, if I'm willing, right, why would the bank not want to lend me but only so much money? Right? Why would the bank use the appraisal to determine whether I'm going to pay back? Because there's two things that they're evaluating. Two things as a lender. They are evaluating the borrower, that's you, the person borrowing money, and they're going to evaluate that on a bunch of different factors, but really it comes down to your DTI, your debt to income ratio, your credit, what is your objective number, as objective as we can come with it. Even with the flawed system of credit scores, it's the best that we've got. And they go, hey, based on your ability in the past to borrow money and to pay it back, how have you proven to do that? Has it been poor? Has it been good? A variety of different loan products, the size, the scale. And so all of that affects your credit. The higher the credit score, in general, the lender has a pretty good idea whether you're going to pay that back or not pay that back. And then reserves. Obviously, if you have a high risk job or if you're self-employed but you have high reserves, the bank goes, well, you're less risky. Okay? The second thing that they are that they're assessing is the asset. The thing that you're actually borrowing against, right? If you're buying a Rolls Royce, or if you're buying a yacht, if you're buying, financing a computer, what they're doing is they're evaluating, like, what is the likelihood that you would default on this specific asset? And that's why the appraisal comes in to begin with. They want to know that the value, right, is there. Just because a seller lists a price, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've had to have this conversation with buyers, is that the list price is determined really by two people, the listing agent and the seller. And sometimes one or both could be wrong. Or sometimes the seller says, hey, Dan, if you want my listing, I want it listed at this number. It takes a very good listing agent to say, hey, I think this is foolish, or this would be ill-advised and here's why. But sometimes you have to let the seller learn the mistake and go, hey, I walked this path before, here's my advice. But if you want to go this path, fine. One of the things I'll say often is, how long do we leave it at your number before we try my number, right? So, and sometimes that's a push and pull, right? So I've had other times where the seller themselves will say, hey, Dan, we trust you. We know that you know the process. You tell us where should we list it to get our three objectives. And usually it's a mixture of timing, net, and the like ease of the contract, if you will. All right, so back to this asset. Value, condition, marketability. Why would they care about the value? Because if you go and you do 100% financing and you fail to pay on that, right? On a VA loan, that's why your VA funding fee exists. It helps cover some of that gap if you were to default, to kind of make up for the difference for them having to take that asset back and turn around and flip that property, right? Because the bank technically is the one buying that property. You're borrowing money to buy it, to live in it, but the bank says, we're using our money, we're buying it on your behalf, okay? And so they want to make sure that when that value is there, if you were to default on it, they want to make sure within a margin of error that they can turn around and sell that back to the market, because they are in the business of what? They're in the business of lending money, not owning assets. We learned a lot of lessons from the 2007 crash, and one of them being like, we do not want you defaulting on your loan. We'll do everything possible to keep you in that home. All right, so if we know that they're buying it and we have this appraisal, we know that it is not a perfect process, but it's the best that we have in place. One of the interesting things, so you have to excuse my nerdiness here, is we have this thing called a bell curve, right? A bell curve shows how things distribute, right? If we had men from 4 foot to 8 foot, we would know that those are outliers. So I have it marked here, 68%, 95%, 99%. For the real nerds are out there, you know I messed up that number, but I'm pretty close. You have first standard deviation, second and third, right? Most men fit within that tight window, most men. And that's why you see the top of the curve, because most of them fit there. And then 95% of men fit within this range, and 99% of men fit within this wider range, right? Including the variety of heights. On an appraisal, when we are looking at it, if we went and hired 100 appraisers to evaluate the value of this home, remember what we're doing is we're trying to justify, is the contract justified? We're trying to justify the contract that is in play. This isn't necessarily an objective third person's opinion of actual market value, because that is what someone is willing and able to pay. This is what the bank wants to know is justifiable, because they're lending you money and they don't want to lend on the asset. So as an example, if their appraisal comes back at $500,000 and your intent to buy it is at $1 million, then there's a gap of $500,000. And they go, look, we're only going to lend you $500,000, because if we have to take this asset back, even if you're willing to put $500,000 down and give that to the seller in excess of what we're going to lend you, we need to be able to flip this asset on the back end based off our money and lending it to you. I hope that makes sense. All right, so is the contract justifiable? What's interesting is most of the data out there supports that if you're going to do 100 different appraisals, that there's a variance somewhere between 5 to 7% on average between appraisals, high or low. Now, that may seem like a lot, but also understand that the appraiser, when they go into this process, most of the time they're doing this. They are trying to justify the contract in play. Does not mean it's perfect, because I can tell you, I get clients all the time that are very irritated. They go, how did the appraisal come back exactly at the number that I'm under contract? Because their job is not to determine perfect market value. Their job is to justify if the contract in play is justifiable, right? So that variation, right? There's really kind of two outcomes. If you're under contract at 400, it's possible that the appraiser's opinion might be, hey, look, I think in some ways you actually have a really good deal here, right? I think that this property potentially could have sold for 420. Now this is rare, it's not perfect, but sometimes this happens. And sometimes the buyer, because one of the things agents will do is go, hey, congratulations, the appraisal came back high, you got all of this equity. And that's not necessarily true, okay? What should be saying is, hey, the appraiser thinks that you got a pretty good deal here. And you may be walking into some equity and a little bit more than you would have otherwise further down the road, because it's not like you're going and turning around and selling this, right, 2 months later for 420. It's more than likely not going to happen. There were times during COVID where we were seeing such rapid appreciation that a year later people were selling, paying the cost of the sale and still making money, but that is a very rare occasion. But really what most often happens is that we run into this scenario, which is that the appraisal potentially comes in low or below the contract, right? Or the appraiser is telling the bank is that I'm having a hard time justifying that this contract value of $400,000 is justifiable, I can only really justify 380. So now we have this gap of 20,000. So what do we do if there's a gap? Let me see if I can move that over just a little bit. Hopefully you can still see all that. What do we do if there's a gap? If there's a gap, we have technically two different agreements, okay? We have an agreement with the bank on the intent to lend or borrow money. We have an agreement with the seller on the intent to buy the house. And those are two separate agreements. It's really important to understand the difference there because the gap has to do with the seller. And the bank says, I'm only going to lend so much based off of the appraisal. In our contract, and this varies a little bit across the nation, but in our contract, we technically have about 3 days from the notice of that shortage to negotiate with the seller. Now you can say, hey, Mr. Seller, the appraised amount is this, I'm 100% financing. I don't have any additional cash. So the only way that I can buy this home is if you lower that price, the contract value, down to the appraised value, because I just don't have the money to bring the difference. Otherwise, unfortunately, what we don't want, but it can happen, this BOM here stands for back on market. Let me see if I can scoot that back just a hair. Back on market. And sellers don't really usually want this, right? They've already packed up, they've already moved out. They don't want to go back on market because what does every buyer on the planet say when it does go back on market? What's wrong with it? And you don't tend to get as good of a contract. It's very rare, but I've seen it. But you don't tend to get contracts the second time around that are as good as the first time. I hope that makes sense. All right, so if it does go back on market, if the deal does fall through, the buyer and seller cannot make ends meet. If they go, look, I really want to buy your house, but I can't, and the seller goes, look, I had 6 contracts behind you, 2 of them are still waiting to see if this deal falls through, and I feel like I have power in this relationship, so if you can't buy it at that number, I've actually had 3 people say, hey, look, if it falls through, I've got extra cash. Now that happens only in markets that are extremely competitive or the house is extremely good, right? Even in a seller's market, you can have a property that is so desirable that everybody wants it, okay? Now, that back on market, that's important. Again, we have an agreement with the seller, or excuse me, the bank and the seller. And just an important understanding here is that a loan does not mean that you intend to buy. That's ITB. Those are 2 different things. What you said at the very beginning of that process is, I intend to buy your house, okay? And I intend to buy your house by acquiring a loan. All right? So what happens in a gap? And there's 2 different gaps I want to talk about. One is the gap that happens during the appraisal process, and the other one is an appraisal guarantee at the beginning of the process, okay? So get under contract, earnest money deposit, usually you have inspections of some sort. There's some type of financing contingency. Again, every area is a little bit different, but for our area, the appraisal gets ordered at some point, usually within 3 days after the inspections are done. If that appraisal comes back and there's a gap, you have 3 days to negotiate the gap, right? If there's a $5,000 gap, you have kind of 3 different ways to go about it. 1, again, the seller lowers the contract price down to the appraised value. 2, the buyer brings that $5,000 to the table in addition to what the loan, money out of their pocket, extra funds. That does not include your down payment and your closing costs. This is in addition to, okay? Very important piece of information there. And they have to be able to do that. Or the third option is to meet somewhere in the middle, 4,000, 1,000, 1,000, 4,000, 25, whatever combination. And you have 3 days to figure that out, okay? So let's just say, for scenario's sake, that you do have an appraisal gap, okay? And we're gonna do this one. And we're gonna say, at the beginning of this process, this property was so competitive that at the beginning, to win the deal, right, you say, hey, seller, because the seller's really trying to optimize 4 different things. I can count, I promise. 4 different things. 1, how much money is going in their pocket. 2, a timeline that works in their benefit. 3, a contract that is easy to fulfill. And 4, risk, the least risky contract that I can take. Now, at the beginning of that, an appraisal guarantee addresses kind of 2 things, right? The risk and the net. Because you may end up bidding up a property that was listed for $400,000 up to $425,000. And if the best comps that are out there are around, say, $405,000, $410,000, the listing agent, if they do a good job in their communication to the buyer's agents, is going to say, hey, look, I appreciate that you've offered us $425,000, but really what I'm looking for is a guarantee as much as possible, because if we get to the appraisal and it comes in low, I know that you and I now have to negotiate. And I would like to avoid that if possible. And so you can do what's called an appraisal guarantee. That's what I have there. And green, that's what that G is, 10K. So let's say in this scenario, the buyer said, hey, look, in addition to my down payment, in addition to my closing costs, I have an additional $10,000 that I have set aside because I need money, my grandparents, wherever the money comes from, they don't really care. As long as it's there and it clears the bank, that's all they care about, right? I have 10K that says if the appraisal were to come in low, I'm saying right now today as the signing of this contract that I'm going to bring that 10K. Any additional gap that could come up, you and I are going to negotiate, but right now I'm willing to bring that 10K, all right? So contract value is 425. Appraisal gets ordered and it comes back at 410. So that 10K immediately is already accounted for. You don't get to renegotiate that because as part of the contract you said, I was willing and able to do this. Back to that willing and able piece right there. All right. Now, the gap that's in addition is 5K. And let's just say for whatever reason it was so competitive that you said, fine, I'll bring it. I don't want to lose this home, because the seller goes, look, I've got like 5 people that called after we got under contract. Like, if you want this house, I'm so secure that I could go back to one of those things without even going back on market, and one of them is going to write me a check. Okay. Again, you have to be very certain about that, because if you go back on market, well, going back on market, people are going to start asking that thing that we said earlier, which is what's wrong with it. Now, we get to that scenario. What's really important to understand is that the lender is lending off of that 410. That's what they're lending off of. Whether that's 100% financing, 5% down, 20% down, whatever, that is what they're lending off of, because your agreement with the bank is to borrow against your debt to income ratio, your credit reserves, on the asset value, and we'll call this remarketability. If I have to take it back, can I put it on the market and get rid of this asset? Because I'm in the business of lending money, not owning property. Okay, so muy importante is that, again, this gap, this extra money, is in addition to your down payment and closing costs. So lending here is off of the 410. As a recap, the contract value is 425. That's your agreement with the seller. This whole process, right, is that sometimes what we want to do is we want to avoid this potential ever coming into play. And this is really important that your agent understands pricing, and that you do this at the very, very beginning, so that when you write an initial contract, you know that within this range, if potentially you're making offers that are way out here. Because the further you get out here, the more and more likely it becomes that a gap is going to even manifest. Okay, that's super important. Now, this may seem super complicated, but it really isn't. And you want to have a guide or a advisor. I'm in the middle of kind of reading a book about Lord of the Rings. You want to have a good Gandalf, a good Aragorn, someone that's going to walk the path with you. That's what we do here. I hope this is super helpful. You can shoot us a text. There's also a link in the description if you want to schedule time with us. Peace.